You have an idea. You want to tell it to the world, but you don't know where to start. That's where Anchor comes in. They have the tools for you to edit, produce, and record your idea right from your phone or computer. It's the easiest way to reach and grow your audience. They publish for you to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major platforms. And to top it all off, they match you with advertisers so you can earn from your passion and your wonderful idea. So tell me, what are you waiting for? Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started and follow your dream. Welcome to Disruptive Adventism. My name is Jose Briones, and I'll be your host for this podcast. This podcast is about discussing the polemical statements and practices that are part of the Adventist fabric, which in turn shape this belief system to be unique and relevant for today's society. Today's podcast will feature a discussion about psychology and its relevance for today's society and Adventism with cognitive science student from University of Central Florida, Bryan Rivera. Thanks for listening, and let us begin. Bryan, thank you for being with us today. Thank you for allowing us to talk with you. Before we start with the podcast, tell us a little bit about yourself. What are you doing right now? What are your plans? How is psychology important?
Hey, well, thank you for having me. I guess as an introduction, I have a degree in psychology, a bachelor's degree from the University of Central Florida. Currently, I'm doing my master's in cognitive science, which, for those of you that don't know, cognitive science is an interdisciplinary field which takes information from like psychology, neuroscience, computer science, linguistics, anthropology, any field that studies the mind and human behavior from different angles. It tries to take all those separate fields and unite them to form a holistic picture of how the mind works. And then as I'm doing that, I enjoy writing a lot. So basically what I've started doing is taking little concepts here and there from what I'm learning, and I'm trying to find ways to apply it to Christianity and Adventism. And I've just spent time just writing little blogs here and there, as well as writing articles for like Adventist Today, 75.1 magazine, and different small magazines.
That's awesome.
Within the church.
I liked what you're doing. I didn't know that much about cognitive science. It seems to be quite a broad field of study. Well, let's talk a little bit about why is psychology important as a general topic. Why is this relevant for today's society?
Well, that's a great question. Let's start by just defining real quick what psychology is. Currently, psychologists study human cognition and behavior. So what that is saying is that it studies how people think and how people behave. So a very straightforward reason why it's important for everybody. If you have a brain, you're going to want to know how it works, right? You want to know what its limits are, what its strengths are, and any information that helps you know yourself better is always going to be a good tool to have. And I'll just give you a quick example. When it comes to the topic of emotions, a lot of people think that to make rational decisions, you almost want to get rid of emotions. You have, like, since Platonic times, like the philosophers, the intellectual, and then the emotional person is often seen as less intelligent. But what we're finding out within psychology is that that's not necessarily the case. There's a relationship between emotions and decisions. So, for example, there's an area in the frontal lobe of the brain called the VMPFC, which stands for the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, blah, 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 blah. But basically, all it is, it's a region that seems to be like the mediator between emotions and higher order functions of the brain. So the question is, what does it do? Well, we know what it does by looking at what happens when it's damaged, right? We find out what went missing. And what we find is that people that have damage to this area, they can score high on intelligence tests. They can function in almost any psychological test that you give them, The only shortcoming that they have is tends to be emotional. They have almost zero emotions. You show them a shocking picture, they don't respond like most people do.
So what you're saying is that there is a connection between emotions and decisions, but these
Correct.
people that may have the prefrontal cortex damage, they may respond well in academic settings, but not in regular life settings, or empathize with other people, or have regular emotions that others will have when they see death or happiness or things like that. Is that what you're pointing at?
In a sense. So that's the foundation, right? So people that have damage to this area, their intellect is good, their emotions are gone. So that's the foundation. But then you ask yourself, when you look at a person like this that has no emotions and high intelligence, you think to yourself, well, they must be making great decisions everywhere in life. Like, that would be the best thing ever, right?
Right.
Not
They're
have to worry
able
about your
to
emotions.
they're able
But what
to
ends up-
rationalize everything.
Yeah. So what ends up happening, though, is that these people become unable to make decisions. They'll go to the grocery store, they'll look at all the cereals, and they'll spend an hour or two looking at all the information and never reach a decision. And it makes you wonder, why is that? Well, it appears to be that in order for us to make decisions, we ascribe value to our choices. And value is an emotional response. We know what we want to eat tomorrow or today because we feel like, for example, let me backtrack a little bit. So we ascribe value to different decisions and their consequences, right? So
Okay.
if I'm looking at an aisle of cereal, I choose which cereal I want because I feel like eating that cereal today, if that makes sense. If today I feel like eating Cheerios, that's an emotional response. It's not necessarily based on the information.
So it's not based
So
on the
we're-
nutritional value or anything else, but it's like, that's my favorite cereal. That's what I want to eat.
Yeah, generally speaking, that's what happens, right? It's based on gut instincts. So, for example, because of that, it's important for people to understand that it's not about following your heart and it's not about ignoring your heart. It's about learning how your heart works and how it's involved in your decisions. If that makes sense.
So the connection, the balance between the mind, the intellectual values of the mind, and the balance between that and the emotions allows us to make rational decisions.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So that's a general overview of why psychology is relevant for the general public, right?
Right.
So why would it be relevant for Christians then? And more specifically, Adventists?
Awesome. That's a good question. And I think this touches at the heart of the reason of why I've chosen to write for a Christian audience. The general public, obviously, it's very diverse. There's different opinions and different goals in the people. But within Christianity, it seems to be the case that everybody has this singular goal in life, right? Which is to do God's will and go to heaven and on and on and on, right? So there's a struggle. And you probably have heard the term before, right? The Christian walk, correct?
Sure, yes.
You can't really say that about the general audience. If they're walking, it's hard to know where they're walking to, that sort of thing, right? But the fact that Christians have this very specific purpose, it means that they are in need of information that helps them know how to walk the Christian walk, if that makes sense. How to get to where they're going and how to make sure they don't fall to the left or to the right.
Yeah, they continue focused on the goal. That's
Right.
what you're saying. Okay.
Right. Which means that they're going to need to know how their own minds work in order to achieve those goals. So here's a good example of what I'm referring to. There's this verse in James that says that each person is tempted when they are lured or enticed by their own desire. That makes temptation something that's very much psychological, if that makes sense, right?
Okay.
So if we're going to resist temptation, we got to know how our minds work and how temptation works in our brain. So here's a quick example It's a bit controversial, but I can explain why. So a couple years ago, maybe even a couple decades, there was this concept called ego depletion. And what it was talking about, or what it was theorizing, is that we as humans have a limited willpower, or to put it another way, it's as if willpower was a liquid in a container, and every time we resist temptation, we draw a little bit of water out of that container and eventually reach a point at which we empty that container, and it becomes way harder to resist temptation. So one of the experiments that they did to try to test this theory was that they had participants come into the lab, and they had a plate of cookies in one end and a plate of radishes on another end. So half of the participants would come in, and they would instruct them to eat the cookies, and then the other half would come in and they were told to eat the radishes. Now, the group that was eating the radishes, in theory, they were resisting the temptation to eat the cookies, right? So they did that little setup of them resisting temptation, and then afterwards they asked both groups to solve a math equation. Now, the thing about the math equation is that it was impossible to solve. They were just trying to see how long it would take for people to give up on the problem, see if there's a difference between the groups. And they found that there was a difference. Those that were eating the cookies, in other words, those that were not resisting temptation, they didn't give up as quickly as those that did resist the temptation and then took the math problems. They tended to give up sooner. So then the theory was that resisting temptation took out energy that was not available when they were solving the math problem. Well, currently that's the whole idea of ego depletion right now is being researched even more, because later on they found that there was an issue with the replication of the experiment. Another group of researchers tried to come back and redo that experiment, and they didn't find the effect that the first group found. But it still makes the idea intriguing. Like, does resisting temptation once make it harder to resist the second time? Another group came in, and what they found out was that maybe it's not about the resisting temptation as such. Maybe it's the sugar that was in the cookies versus the radishes. Maybe it's the energy from the glucose in the sugar that made it easier for people, that allowed them to not give up as soon on the problem.
Oh, interesting. So there's like two possibilities in this case. It's not necessarily saying like, oh, once you resist once, it's harder for you to resist. But It's more like there was more to the science behind the experiment than what meets the eye.
Correct. There was more to the story. And I think the second one about the glucose in the sugar, it's even more interesting to me, particularly within Adventism and when it comes to nutrition, because we believe that we're supposed to be healthy, that our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit, and that by being healthy, our minds are ready to tackle whatever may come, right?
Correct.
So the fact that obviously eating cookies is not it wouldn't be the optimal thing, but it goes to show that nutrition does affect how we engage with the world, and perhaps having diets that are appropriate for a person can help when it comes to resisting temptations later on.
That's very interesting that you mentioned that, since in the last couple of weeks we have been going over animal care and veganism. We had a discussion with Paul about it. So there seems to be a relation between nutrition and psychology from your perspective. Now, we also talked about activism in the last couple of podcasts. And something that is intriguing me is, how is this relationship, Adventists that are active in the world, how does that relate to the psychology sphere? How is that connected?
Well, I think when it comes to activism, something that will help everybody is being mentally active.
How is that? How is that going to happen? How are we going to be mentally active?
Well, you can take several approaches, but I think an approach that doesn't really get discussed as often is education in general, and then more specifically, education about how the mind works. And the reason for this is because a lot of the issues that are happening in the world, and a lot of the things that you hear about in the news and such, they have to deal with they have to do with human behavior at the end of the day. Like, activism is engaging with other human beings, and other human beings have a mind, if that makes sense. So understanding, before you can be active, you have to understand, you have to be knowledgeable about how you're going to approach it and how you're going to do it. And a lot of people skip the fact about educating themselves first on the topic before becoming active, if that makes sense.
So you're saying that, before actually carrying out your actions, you need to understand why you're carrying out your actions.
Yeah, prepare yourself. Know how you're going to engage in whatever you're going to engage in. I usually don't get into politics that much, but when I guess, as coming from a psychological perspective, a lot of the issues that I see going on in politics, it seems like it's working top down instead of bottom up. People pick a position first, and then they try to assume how people work as a response. So a quick example would be like abortion. I mean, abortion is not a topic we talk about in psychology, but it's a good example. People decide to be liberal first or conservative, and then based on that, they try to make their case about why abortion is wrong or right, instead of first trying to figure out what abortion is a fetus a child or not. Find that information first, then come up with your political position.
So you're saying that the psychological method, or the ability, the method that allows us to be active, to continue to be active in the world and to engage with these matters, is to educate ourselves on the matter and then start carrying out our positions. That's right. How
correct.
Okay.
Right. Basically, prepare yourself before engaging the enemy.
Okay.
Right. Like a good soldier in any field, right?
Sounds good. That's a very good example of how to be active in the psychological sphere or just the life sphere as a whole. Now, one more thing that sometimes gets misunderstood or maybe overlooked is how Christians and maybe even ministers interact with psychology, right? Do you think that it's important for ministers to interact with psychology?
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, so from my perspective, I feel like obviously we don't live in a perfect world where everything can be perfect, ironically enough. But I do feel like pastors and those in leadership positions within the church, it's almost as if I wish they were psychologists themselves, because they're tasked with the role of helping human beings in the Christian walk, right? That means they need to understand, probably more than me, essentially, how the mind works and how to help people that are going through all sorts of psychological issues, family issues, societal issues, anything from depression, divorce. All of those things are issues that psychologists have studied that will be a great tool and an asset for theologians and pastors to have. And to look at it another way, when I read the Bible, it becomes clear to me that it's almost as if God himself is a psychologist. There's no doubt that he created the human mind. He knows how it works. He knows how it functions. He knows its limits. And through my academic journey, I think it's a great privilege to see and study how the human brain was designed and how God wants it to function and how it doesn't function and what its strengths are, its weaknesses are. I'll give you a quick example just to sort of show, sort of emphasize why I think God at his heart is a psychologist himself. So a couple years ago at Southern, I was taking a course in cognitive psychology. And one of the topics that you cover in cognitive psychology is memory. And one of the earliest research papers that were published on the topic of memory had to do with how many digits a person can memorize when it comes to short-term working memory. And what that paper concluded was that the limit was, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's very popular. It's called the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. So basically saying that the limit of how much we can remember in short-term memory, it's usually around 7 digits for people on average, right?
That's very interesting. Didn't know that.
it's interesting. But then look at it from the theological perspective when it comes to the Sabbath. When it comes to the Sabbath, we're talking about God's specifically saying, remember every seventh day. And then I'm here studying about memory and about 7 units. It's like the very, it's the pinnacle of what short-term memory can handle.
There seems to be some sort of connection in there. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a very trivial or it's just interesting fact, but it goes to show that God does know something about how the brain works. Because if he had made the Sabbath every 14 days, perhaps in that sense we have an excuse to forget. But the fact that it's within the seventh day, which is where our memory tends to cut off, it's as if the seventh day was designed for how the brain remembers, in a sense. So it's little things like that I'm like, man, I mean, God really does know how our brain works, and we don't really think about it that often. I would like to see pastors and theologians taking more of a psychological approach, because I feel like there's a lot of hidden gems there that aren't always explored.
Yeah, that's very good. I think the same. I think that pastors should also be engaged in the psychological sphere and learn more about the different parts of the brain and how it functions. I think that you have a very valid point. Now, let's talk a little bit about passivity, since we talked about activity. Why shouldn't we be passive? Why should we strive to learn more as pastors, theologians, as people, as construction workers, as every profession? Why should every profession learn something and not just be passive?
That's a great question. And I kind of want to go off a little bit with what Judith said on the last podcast. She brought up the concept of atrophy. Typically, when you have a muscle that you don't exercise, it weakens and it atrophies. If you don't use it, you lose it. That's generally the rule. But there's another concept that doesn't get talked about very much. Obviously, when you exercise, your muscles do get larger and they do get stronger. But you don't always want them to become stronger endlessly. You also want them to become smarter. And this brings up the idea of muscle memory. So, for example, say you're learning the guitar for the first time. The first couple of trials, it's typically hard, you struggle through it, and then as you keep practicing, it becomes easier and it becomes automated, and you develop this muscle memory that it allows you to do this activity that you struggle with at first a lot easier. The interesting thing about muscle memory, it's a little bit of a misnomer, because the memory isn't stored in your muscles. The memory is stored in your brain. It's your brain that's remembering how to use the muscle in this way or that. So this concept takes us back to activism. If we keep in mind that we only have one brain, and the same concept that allows muscle memory to happen is the same brain that's allowing memory to develop in any other activity that we do. So for example, I think, I may be misquoting here, but I think you did also talk about how sometimes it's a struggle to be active. It's not an easy task being active. You naturally just want to be passive in a sense. But something that helps with that is fighting through it, because fighting through it, that's how habits are born. And habits is nothing more than just muscle memory applied to everything else we do. A habit is, at the end of the day, it's just a behavior that's been ingrained into you, and it's become easier. You don't just become stronger at it, it becomes automated. It becomes a part of you, essentially, and that's what memory is. So that's why I think it's important not to be passive, because when we allow ourselves to be passive, we don't just not become strong, we don't become smart in that sense, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. So it's allowing us to become smarter, to become active in the sphere, and to continue to grow. I think that's maybe what you're also trying, in summary, what you're trying to point at.
Yeah. Smarter in a practical sense, not in an intellectual sense.
Right. So, as you know, we have touched upon certain topics, emotions and intellect. They're both essential, correct?
Yes, they're both. I mean, God gave us both of them for a reason. So right. we can't throw one away and keep the other. We have to know how they both function.
And they're important for the Christian walk because it allows us to kind of keep that balance. That's what we talked about. Well, thanks a lot for all of these insights that you have brought into the conversation. I think it allows us to know how Adventism is disruptive in this scene, right? In the psychological scene. It helps us to see that we're trying to strike that balance. We're trying to look for that future, for that active practice, to look for the habits and to build them right together for the purpose of becoming a better world.
Right.
Well, thanks again, Bryan, for spending some time with us talking about psychology, ego depletion, why is it important for general society, and how to educate ourselves for, constructing a better world. If you have some final thoughts, this is your time. Go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, first of all. It was a pleasure to be here engaging in conversation. Yeah, I guess if I could just leave everybody with a last piece of advice, it would be to just look into how the mind works a little bit more. Take that extra 5 minutes to think about why it is that you do what you do and why it is that people do what they do. Because the whole reason why psychology even exists is because there's enough similarities between brains to actually have a field that can study them, right? So we're all essentially, obviously we all have our unique aspects and our unique outlooks on the world and how we behave, but there's enough overlap between us that it's safe to say that we're all in the same boat together. It's a good approach to not look at people as your enemies sometimes. It's good to take a step back and try to empathize more with people and think about how their brains are working and how that compares to you. Try reading the Bible from a psychological perspective. Just pick a random book and try to read it thinking like a psychologist would think. Try to see how people are behaving. Don't just read what they're saying. Just try to take a step beyond that and just think about. Realize that these are real people with real brains that work in certain ways, and try to just extract those little gems that are hidden throughout Scripture. And then also realize that God Himself created the human mind. So see how He interacts with people, and ask yourself, why is He interacting that way? I think that's a good outlook to have.
That was our interview with University of Central Florida graduate Bryan Rivera. If you want to read more of his content, you can find it at johnbryan.blog. Again, johnbryan.blog, or look for his upcoming book, The Language of God. Thank you for listening today. I hope that we have intrigued you a little bit and that you decide to stay around for future podcasts. If you have any comments, feedback, or a topic you would like us to discuss, please go to our website at www.disruptiveadventism.org or shoot us an email to disruptiveadventism@gmail.com. We're eager to engage in discussions about any matter, so don't hesitate to contact us. This has been it for today. We hope you join us next time, and as always, we invite you to be disruptive.